Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel for a quarterly favourites. So what I wanted to do in this video was just to sit down and reflect on the first quarter of this year, which I can't believe has already passed. So January, February, March, and talk about the best books I read, the best films I watched, maybe the best TV shows I watched, the best games I played, and potentially anything else that might come to mind. I thought since I'm not doing reading wrap-ups at the minute and I'm not vlogging everything I read, it would be a good opportunity to talk about some of the books that, you know, really stood out to me that I really loved and I want to like shout out and make sure you check out if they are of interest to you. But also, you know, while I'm here, I've seen some good films, I've played some good games, why not talk about it all? So even though we're already halfway through April, I hope this isn't considered too late for a quarterly wrap-up slash favourites, and I hope you will enjoy it and maybe recommend some things to me too. So without further ado, let's get started, shall we? Starting with the books. I feel like that is the natural place to start, and I love doing these kind of like check-in favourites because it's always fun to see like what is your favourite sort of like a quarter of the way into the year, halfway into the year, and then at the end of the year. But all of the first 3 months of the year, and I will say I've already read some bangers in April, so I already know some books are going to be in the next quarterly favourites. I have 5 books I want to talk about. So first up, I have 2 mystery thriller novels, and those are The Night She Disappeared by Lisa Jewell and Night Will Find You by Julia Heberlin. I didn't even realise until I started talking now that both those titles had night in them. I mean, serendipitous maybe, I don't know. And these are both books by authors who I've previously read and adored in the past. These 2 authors are 2 of my favourite thriller writers. Like, if you enjoy a mystery or thriller novel and haven't checked either of these 2 out, I would highly recommend it. And these are 2 of my favourite by them, actually, particularly Julia Heberlin. This might be my new favourite book by her, so let's start with that. So this book is set in Texas, like a lot of Julia Heberlin's thrillers, and it has a very like sort of clammy, moody atmosphere that really feels as if you are there with the characters, and I always really enjoy that about her books. The setting is very rich for me, and it always kind of makes me want to go to Texas, even though I'm reading about murders. I don't know what that's about. What really stands out about this book and makes it particularly unique is that our protagonist is 2 things. I mean, she's a lot of things, but in particular 2 things, and one of those is an astrophysicist who's currently working on a grant that she's received to study some lights in the sky, in space, and also a psychic. Now, she doesn't refer to herself as a psychic, but she has inherited some sort of gift from her mother, which means she sort of like gets little visions, little insights about either the missing or the dead or your loved ones, and it is very much situated in the sense that this is real. This is not something that she is making up. It's not something she's hallucinating. It's not something that is a sort of like kind of con, and if anything she tries to avoid that part of herself because she's also a scientist and she's invested in her career as a scientist, and she's not trying to make a career as a psychic, but because her gift is known to some people close to her, she's called in to help the police on a few she's called in by the police every now and then to give them some insights. And at the beginning of this novel, she gets pulled into the case of a missing girl that disappeared years ago and nobody knows what happened to, but because of the way she responds to a piece of evidence, she ends up helping this other skeptical detective with this investigation. But then that seeps into her personal life, right? Because she never intended to be like a public psychic, but this gets brought into the media and into this like weird alt-right podcast conspiracy theory sphere, and things feel like they're kind of getting out of control, right? And I loved the character. So there's an interesting mystery there that you're very invested in and you want to know the end of, but I actually felt like the main like sort of pull of this book was our protagonist and those dual parts of her life and her relationship with her family and her friends and possible love interests if there's any, and everything that's going on there, and I loved that. So I really loved her as a character, and I felt like she really made this book interesting and really fascinating and unique. So I really, really loved this book. And then for the Lisa Jewell novel, this was one also about a missing girl actually, but it's dual timeline perspective, which is true of most of Lisa Jewell's books that I've read and really enjoyed, where you're getting different characters narrating the story from different periods. So we have a girl who went missing, who's a young teenage mother, and we're reading her story from the time before she went missing, from her perspective. We're then reading what happened when she went missing from her mum's perspective. And then we're reading the current timeline, where there is potentially new evidence that's arisen about this girl's disappearance. It only happened like a year or two ago, from the perspective of a mystery writer who's recently moved to town. And it's just really well done. I really like the way that Lisa Jewell weaves a story together. You really find yourself invested in all of the different timelines and trying to figure out what's going to happen, and also like hoping things work out for the best, right? They're generally quite slow paced, and I'd say that's true of this. They're not like sort of turn the corner, jump scare in your face thrillers. They're quite like domestic thrillers, I think is one of the terms that's used, but I always adore them. I always find them really compelling in the way they're written. I find Lisa Jewell again does character writing really, really well, the nuances of characters, and I just really enjoyed this book. It's just another win from Lisa Jewell for me. I then have two contemporary romance novels, because I was very, very much in deep with the contemporary romance last year and early this year. It was like one of the main genres I wanted to read and was reading, and I actually filmed a top 10 contemporary romance video, which you can check out, and it included these two books. So I'm not going to say too much about them, because obviously if you want to hear more you can check out that video, but briefly there is Take a Hike by Mimi Grace, which is a short contemporary romance about a young woman who hasn't figured out what she wants to do with her life yet, but she ends up inheriting a sort of nature reserve slash retreat type place where you do outdoor activities and learn about the wilderness from her mother's ex-boyfriend. And she decides to like take this as a challenge, go there for the summer, try and run this retreat, work with the people there, and figure out if this is what's right for her. But she ends up butting heads a little bit with the manager of the retreat, who had in fact been hoping to inherit it. But butting heads in romance obviously means romance. So yeah, that happens. And then we have The Cock Down the Block, which I would definitely describe as like romantic comedy. This book was really funny, and it's about a fake dating relationship that develops between two like lifelong friends. They've been friends since they were teenagers, and the man in this instance is now like a super famous sports person. I don't know anything about sports. I think he plays American football. I actually forgot for a second, but he plays sports and he's very famous. And she's a librarian next door, and he has always been in love with her. So he basically takes the opportunity to fake date her in order to prove to her that he is the man for her, while she is entirely oblivious, but slowly realises she's also in love with him. So very, very cute, very funny, very entertaining. And then lastly for books, because I do actually have a magazine to talk about next, is a non-fiction book, and that is Women's Lore. 4,000 Years of Sirens, Serpents and Succubi by Sarah Clegg. Had to check the subtitle there. This book was so interesting. I listened to an audiobook, but I did end up buying the physical book because I wanted to be able to look back on certain parts of it and check out some of the references, and you know, it's not so far removed from the kind of things that I research and I'm interested in that I know it will come in handy in the future. So this book was, you know, 4,000 Years of Women's Lore. It was basically looking at a very specific theme or trope or figure from mythology, a figure who is different in different mythologies but could very well be a development of the earlier version, for example. You know, they're all connected, and that is these sort of serpentine women. So this includes women who are both like half serpent, but also women who just like have similar qualities to the serpent-like women and who have fulfilled a similar role in mythologies, and how that's changed depending on the culture and the context and the religion that's talking about it, and where those connections might weave through. And it was so fascinating. I loved seeing the exploration of this one theme through mythology, from, you know, like the ancient Assyrians, through the ancient Greeks, to the sort of early Christianity, Judaism, into the medieval era, and how that was interpreted. And we're going, you know, a long, long period of time. But it was so interesting, and I just absolutely loved it. I think I want more books like that, which take one very specific theme whether it be like a creature, a figure, incident in mythology, and just like explore that in an accessible, interesting, well-researched way. And then also look at some of like the modern context of that as well. You know, there are references to certain like pop culture figures that have maybe been inspired by this character as well. So I loved this book. I thought it was really, really well done, really well researched, but also really easy to sort of like jump into, I felt. I'm definitely interested in reading more by Sarah Clegg, and also would love some more book recommendations that take a similar approach to history or mythology. So yeah, let me know. On that topic, in fact, what I also loved about this book was the historical context. It wasn't just like, here's a myth. It was like what this myth meant to like ordinary women in the society at the time, and how that transfers into like medical practices and like curse tablets, etc., and just sort of like how we can learn more about like actual lives through myth, and I'm a big believer in that. So yeah, I really enjoyed that too. Editing Jean here. I forgot a book. I had a list on my phone and I thought I knew it off by heart, so I didn't bother checking it. And I completely forgot to mention one of my favourite books from the first quarter, and I loved it enough that I have to include this little awkward editing video clip. And that is Fireheart Tiger by Aliette de Bodard. So this is a Tor fantasy novella that I just absolutely adored, which isn't really surprising given that I A, love the Tor novella series, and B, love Aliette de Bodard. Basically, I'm just including a bunch of authors who I love books by in this favourite section that I've read previously and continue to enjoy their books. But this one was just really beautiful. It was a sapphic story with some like which took some surprising directions, I will say. I really enjoyed, and there's definitely some like toxic relationship tropes in there, like exploring those, which I really appreciated. And it's about a young woman who's from one kingdom, and she's sort of spends her childhood in another kingdom, or at least like her teenage years in another kingdom, as a sort of like, you know, foster child, you know, that kind of like way of swapping royal children to make connections between courts. And now she's back at her mother's court trying to like find her place, and past love comes back to the palace, but in the meantime she's been struggling with this strange phenomenon that's been happening around her where things have been randomly setting on fire. I'll say no more, but it's really beautifully written. Moving on, we have a magazine, and I believe I have all 4 current issues of this magazine at the moment. I picked these up in Black Moon Botanica, which is a sort of like esoteric candle shop in Edinburgh that also sells fantastic like zines and magazines and books, etc. So this was all they had. I originally picked up volumes 1 and 2, which are these 2, and immediately read them. Like, read this in a day, then got stuck into volume 2 and knew I had to go back for the next 2 volumes. So like, you know, I was gotten good. So this is what, which is a word in itself that is highly disputed. It's the first word of the Old English poem Beowulf. So that is what this magazine is named after, and it is a magazine about history, about pop culture, about mythology, about the esoteric, about folklore, about archaeology, about music, about everything. Language, and to be honest, that's just the stuff that's covered in issue 1. So issue 1 is folklore and folk horror. Issue 2 is myths and legends, and there's a particularly heavy focus in this one on Arthurian legends. Then we have issue 3, which is ancient stones and megaliths. I have to say, having studied megaliths briefly during an archaeology course at university, they're a lot drier than you think they might be. And then witchcraft and cunning folk. So those are the 4 current issues and their subsections. But I'll focus a little bit on issue 1 since it's the one that really, you know, like kind of captured my imagination and got me to pick up the rest of them, and I really enjoyed it. So this has a bunch of different articles, all the way from an interview with a classic rock heavy metal band who sing music inspired by folklore called Green Lung, which I really enjoyed reading about. And since started listening to Green Lung. I'd never heard of them before, but their music is brilliant. Maxine Witch Queen is one of my favourites. Love that song. An article on vampires and the LGBTQ+, a sort of like analysis of the TV show Detectorists, which I'd never seen before. Some articles about horror games, an article about the traditions of the Wicker Man and kind of how that dates back to kind of Romans writing about the Celts in Britain. And so, like I said, you got a little bit about pop culture, a little bit about literature, a little bit about music, a little bit about history, and I really enjoyed that. All of the articles were really interesting. They introduced me to some new topics, they expanded on some topics I already knew about. They also introduced me to some new like scholars. That's one of the things that I really enjoy about my other favourite magazine, which is Hellebore. I often find new scholars and writers to check out online and to check out their work from their like brief articles. For example, I recently read a book called Night Terrors, which I learned about because the author of that book, the academic who'd written that book, had written an article for Hellebore. So yeah, I think also if you've checked out Hellebore on my recommendation before, you'll really enjoy this magazine too, and I'm really enjoying it. So yeah. So that's all the reading material I have to talk about, and now let's move on to TV and film. And I only have one TV show, so I'm going to start with that. And it's one that if you're chronically online like I am, you may very well have heard about already, but I was recently talking about it with my friend Leanne, and she hadn't heard of it or watched it, so I felt very like vindicated that I was able to introduce her to it, and I'm thinking, you know, I might be able to introduce some of you to it too, and that is Has Been Hotel. If you know, you know. This is a phenomenon. Has Been Hotel is an adult animated series that was produced by A24 and picked up by Amazon Prime after having had a pilot produced for YouTube years ago. So like it only recently came out in full, the first season, but it's a phenomenon that's been going on for years, and it's one that my partner had actually been following a little bit. Like he had been listening to some of the songs that had been recorded for it or been inspired by it prior to the actual series coming out. So I'd had this tiny bit of exposure to it through him beforehand, but really not much. And when it came onto Prime, he was super excited to watch it, and I said, yeah, let's watch it together, and I'm so glad we did. It is a musical. I can't remember if I mentioned that already, but it's a musical animated series as well, and the music is just something else. Like, it's a great TV show, don't get me wrong. It's really fun, it's funny, it's actually got some really fun like satire and commentary in there, as well as a lot of heart and emotion. But it's the music that elevates it. Like, that's what brings it to that whole other level of being like absolutely incredible. And if you're interested, my favourite songs are Loser Baby, obviously, because, I mean, Keith David.
It's time to lose yourself, loathe, excuse yourself, let hope in.
Hell's Greatest Dad and You'd Stayed Gone. Those are, yeah, I think my top 3 songs. And Lucifer is my favourite character. So if you haven't already guessed, this TV show is set in hell. It is following Charlie, who is the daughter of Lilith and Lucifer, as she decides to set up the Has Been Hotel, which is a hotel for sinners to be redeemed. So she wants to bring sinners in there and help them sort of like grow as people, be redeemed and get up to heaven. Or at least that's her intention. She hasn't got heaven on board yet, but like that's the plan. And Charlie just has so much positivity and hope, and there's such a wonderful range of characters and companions for Charlie throughout the series who've been through some awful things. This is very much a adult series, despite being animated and a musical and that all being fun, is quite heartbreaking in moments, but it's so interesting and well done. And although I think the first couple episodes are a bit set up and like a little bit slow to get into, like once like the big story arc feels like it comes into play, you can't stop watching. It's phenomenal, can't wait for season 2. Then we have 2 films that I want to talk about. So I do really like going to the cinema, and these are both films that came out this year as well as having been films that I watched this year in the cinema. And the first one is Drive Away Dolls, and I really enjoyed this film. And the reason I sound surprised is because it's not got great reviews. Like, it doesn't have a great sort of audience rating, and there might be a variety of reasons for that. There could always just be like homophobia at play, but I also know a bunch of people who are part of the LGBTQ plus community who don't really like it. So, you know, I don't think that's entirely what's going on there, but I recently felt very vindicated by my enjoyment of this film when Rowan posted a TikTok about it, Rowan Ellis, who I'll link down below, and she was just asking why not more people love it because she loved it, and I was like, yes, thank you, Rowan, me too. So, you know, I'm going to continue to advocate checking this film out. It is be gay, do crime, like in a film. Now, I will say what is interesting about this film is that it is the product of one of the Quering brothers. So usually the Quering brothers work together. In this instance, they didn't. But I will say I find the Quering brothers' style very divisive. And actually, it's a style that I haven't always gotten on with. It's very, very distinct. It doesn't take itself very seriously, and that's not necessarily what doesn't always work for me. I think it's more of like the choppiness of the way they do their films. So it hasn't always worked for me in the past. For example, I hated Burn After Reading. I loved Oh Brother Where Art Thou. So like I have a mixed experience with their films, and this, although not being like a Coen Brothers production, still very much has that style. So I can understand if stylistically it doesn't really work for you, but I thought it was hilarious. Like, it's so campy, it's so ridiculous, it's so charming. It's a road trip in the 90s or early 2000s following two lesbians who don't realise that they've accidentally gotten themselves involved in a sort of like criminal underworld, and you will not necessarily see coming what this criminal underworld is all about, although you might if you've seen other Coen Brother films. And I just really enjoyed it. I thought it was really well done. I thought the acting was like tick, tick, tick. And despite some of the reviews, I'd say give it a shot. Then we have Immaculate, which is a horror film starring, and actually I think like sort of spearheaded by Sydney Sweeney. And this story follows a nun from the US who takes up a position at a nunnery in Italy where the nuns there really just care for older nuns who are passing away. It's almost like a hospice. And she ends up pregnant immaculately. That is the title. So she ends up the focus of a sort of immaculate conception that she doesn't understand where it came from. But the priests and the nuns and just generally the church that she has found herself in are very excited about this conception. They're like, oh, yeah, we're excited, this is cool. Can I say more than that about the plot? Not really, without spoiling anything. But I actually thought this film had some great twists and turns. Like, immaculate conception, babies and the church are not new things in horror, and this definitely like ticks some of the boxes in like the classic tropes of that sort of horror subgenre. But I also thought that there was some excellent twists and turns you don't see coming. Like, I don't think this film is predictable as you might necessarily expect it to be, and I really enjoyed that. But I also just enjoyed the way it delivered those tropes and those themes. I really enjoyed Sydney Sweeney as a character. She was never like into this whole idea. She was shocked and confused by what was happening, but she wasn't just accepting of it either, and I really enjoyed how she was really uncomfortable with what was happening, and it felt like it was exploring the violation that this was to her body, and I really appreciated that aspect of it. There is some quite like violent, gory moments in it, not too many, but like a couple where I had to go like this. And I also thought it was beautifully filmed. Like, the filming, the scoring were all done beautifully, and it actually sort of reminded me of sort of like mid 20th century classic Italian cinema. I don't know if that's just because it was set in Italy, but like the music and the shots reminded me of some of the films I've seen from that era. I mean, the bells gave me like Fellini flashback. So yeah, there's something quite recognisable about the film, but I also thought it was done really, really well, and I really, really enjoyed it. So I would highly recommend that one if you're into horror. And with that, we move on to games. First up, two video games, specifically for the Switch. At least that's where I've played them, but I'm sure they're available on other platforms too. And we may as well start with the one that I have undeniably been playing more than any game at all this year, starting in the end of 2023 and then just like playing and playing and playing and playing and playing. This game took over my life a little bit, but I absolutely love it, and it is Hades. Yes, I am incredibly late to the party on this one. It's not a new game, neither of these games are, but I finally picked it up at the end of 2023, and then, like I said, just couldn't stop playing it. It is phenomenal, and of course inspired by Greek mythology. So Hades is a dungeon crawling roguelike game, which is one of my favourite like sort of subgenres of games, and the next game on this list is also a dungeon crawling game, so just FYI. But one of the things I really like about Hades is that there's this storyline interwoven in the game, and it's a storyline on multiple levels, which I really, really enjoy. So you are Zagreus, the son of Hades, and you're basically trying to escape the underworld. Like, you're done, you want to go to the world above, you want to meet the Olympians, you've got like plans and things you want to do, so you keep trying to leave. And obviously, like with any sort of dungeon crawling game or roguelike game, the more you play, the more skills you garner, the better you get it, and the closer you get to leaving. But Hades doesn't want you to leave, and there are reasons for that, and you sort of start to figure them out as you go along in the game, and you also learn more about like your aunts and your uncles on Olympus, and the other gods and goddesses and heroes that live with you in the underworld, like Achilles and Patroclus and Nyx. And it was really interesting playing this game at the beginning, in fact, because there was certain things about Greek mythology that I was like, why has the game done that? Like, why have the storytellers decided to go down that route? Like, I understand sort of in the context of making a game, you might change things, but I was like, that's interesting, why have they changed that? And then you start to sort of learn more as you go along, and I really appreciated that. I was like, oh, I like the way they've played with myth here, or like, oh, they've subverted my expectations here, and I thought that was a lot of fun. But then obviously the game mechanics themselves are just fantastic. I think it's one of my favourite dungeon crawling games. It's probably my favourite. Oh, it's so hard to say that because I love Cult of the Lamb. Like, I love Cult of the Lamb like nothing else. But the mechanics of the actual dungeons as you go through them, and you're like fighting the underworld monsters and the heroes, etc., that don't want you to leave, is really fun, and I really like that. But I also like that the story, but I think having that storyline elevates it as a game, and the fact that you can learn about all of the different characters and the kind of world that the game creators have created. So I really, really enjoyed that. And then all the references to Greek mythology, fun. And then, like I mentioned, game number 2 is also a dungeon crawler, and that is Moonlighter, another not particularly recent game, but I finally checked it out this year and I am loving it. So for context, I did escape Hades in the game Hades, and there is still plenty to do once you've escaped Hades. Like, the game still has a lot of playability in it, don't get me wrong, but that initial compulsion to keep playing faded a little bit, and I wanted something new, so I decided to try Moonlighter, and I am not disappointed at all. I've only opened like the second cave slash dungeon. I'm not like super far into it, but I'm really enjoying it. And what I love about this, a little bit similarly to Cult of the Lamb, is that there's sort of two parts to it. There's the dungeon crawler aspect, and then there's the sort of outside world and what you're doing there. So you're actually running a little shop. So you're running a little shop that has been part of your family for a long, long, long time in this town, which has access to these dungeons where there's all these artifacts, and you can go into these dungeons and gather artifacts and then sell them in your shops, and obviously you have to fight little monsters to get the artifacts, and then you sell them in your shop. And then as you get more money and you spend more time exploring the dungeons, you can start to grow this little town and fund other shops and businesses joining you, and you can expand your shop, and you can help everything grow, and you can learn a little bit more about the mystery of this town and these dungeons. And I really enjoy this because my attention span can be a little bit flighty, and similarly to Cult of the Lamb, which is one of my other favourite games, sometimes I want to dungeon crawl, sometimes I want to do a little fighting, and then sometimes I just want to like run my little shop. And I can do both those things with those games, and I can do one for 10 minutes and one for 5 minutes, or I can do one for 20 minutes and then one for 30 minutes, or I can just do a little bit of the shop that day if that's what I'm in the mood for, or I can just go and fight little blobby monsters in the dungeons that day if that's what I'm in the mood for. And a game like that, it really captures my attention because I'm able to do different kinds of things in it. And if you have more recommendations of games like Cult of the Lamb, Hades, Moonlighter, please do let me know, because I'd love, love, love to check them out. But if you like your games in a physical format, do not worry, because I have a recommendation for you too, and that is probably very, very predictably Wormspan. Now, there's a reason why this is probably predictable to anybody that's super into board games. Wormspan is actually a sort of redo, a sort of new version and update on a classic game called Wingspan, which is one of my absolute favourites. Now, Wingspan is a bird collecting game where you're collecting birds, you're laying eggs, you're trying to have the best aviary about. Great times for all. And recently, and last year I think it was, the creators of and last year I believe it was last year, the creators of Wingspan announced Wormspan, which is a similar but not exactly the same game, and I think that's important to Wingspan, but instead of birds, it's dragons, hence worm. So we all know I love dragons, and so does my partner. So for my birthday, he actually bought me Wormspan, and we were both excited to play it, and I was excited to have it, even if it was just like Wingspan sort of with new illustrations. You know, I love that game, and if we're going to play with dragons instead of birds, I'm down. Like, that's still really fun. But there's actually some new components to it which I think really show how much the creators cared about this project. It isn't just a completely rebranded version of Wingspan, it is a similar game. It's still a game where you're collecting dragons instead of birds, but there's some added components, there's some added little aspects of the gameplay that change how things are done ever so slightly, that still make it something new to learn and something slightly different to play. So you might be in the mood for Wormspan or Wingspan, or you might be in the mood for either. Like, it can deliver something slightly different, or it can deliver something slightly similar. And then just again, to compare it to Wingspan, the different birds have different abilities in Wingspan. So obviously you also have the different abilities of the different dragons in Wormspan. Then lastly, I just want to talk about two little things on a more personal note. So these are things I've created more generally, and just some of the responses I've received to them. So the first of them is, of course, my most recent book to have come out, which came out at the end of January, and that is All the Violet Tiaras, Quering the Greek Myths, which is a short non-fiction book for adults. I wrote all about the popularity of Greek myth retellings in LGBTQ plus literature and communities, and in like some other little bits of media too, and kind of to what effect that's used, what that means, sort of like how it connects us to antiquity and to ourselves in modern LGBTQ plus community and spaces. And it was a book I poured a lot of love into and really enjoyed writing, and since it's come out I've just had the most wonderful response. I've had so many lovely people like tag me on Instagram and other places to say they enjoyed the book, or they picked it up, or they've checked out some of the literature I've discussed in it, and they've added books to their TBR, and it's made them think about these books differently, and it's just been so heartwarming to see the engagement with the book and the topic of the book and the text in the book. It's just been absolutely lovely, and I really appreciate that. So I just wanted to say a massive thank you. And then secondly is my podcast, That's Ancient History. So I brought back That's Ancient History this year after a hiatus of 2 or 3 years. It had been since I last recorded it, and I made a slight change to the podcast, or added something to the podcast, in that I now upload the episodes to YouTube as well here on this channel. It's still available on all the podcast apps, don't get me wrong, because it is a podcast, so if you don't want to watch it, that's absolutely fine, but I just wanted to make sure it was everywhere you could possibly find it. And we've got 2 episodes currently up, and I have a new episode coming up later this month. I'm currently trying to upload the last Monday of every month, so once a month, and I'm really excited for the interview that's coming up at the end of this month, so stay tuned for that. But I loved recording the previous 2 episodes with Megan and Erica. They were wonderful guests. I'm really grateful for them to like sort of supporting the return of this podcast after such a long hiatus, and it's just been really nice going back to that project, because it was a project I was really passionate about, and I'm still passionate about, and I'm excited to see where it goes in the future, and what topics I'll get to discuss in the future with all of you. And again, it's just been really nice seeing that you're still interested and engaged with it and listening to it and watching it. So thank you so much if you have been listening or watching that since it's come back out. And if I had a publicist, they'd probably be telling me at this point to say, if you could review it on the appropriate apps, that would be wonderful. If you want to go onto Apple and give it a star rating or a little review, that's a massive help. So yeah, if you've got time, that would be great, but just generally listening is wonderful. So thank you so much, and I'm always open to requests for future guests or topics that you might like to hear discussed on the podcast, so just let me know and I'll see what I can do about them. But those are some of my favourite things, some of the best things for me from the past few months, from the first quarter of 2024. I hope you enjoy them too if you check any of them out, and I would love to know some of your favourite parts of the first quarter of this year, whether it be books, games, films, TV shows, what have you. Let me know what they are, because I'm always looking for more excellent entertainment and media in my life. So yeah, until next time, happy reading, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye everyone.